Te whare wānanga o Tāmaki Makaurau, ki tūnei, tēnā koe, ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, Ngāti Whātua, kia ora koutou, e ngā hoe whā, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. Greetings everybody, and thank you all for coming here. It's very rare that I arrive at a public meeting with sort of 3/4 of an hour to go and the room's already half full. So I think that was a really interesting experience. We should have organised a much larger venue, of course. So I take some responsibility for that. I said to Jane, well, at least 100. Make sure it's at least 100. Well, okay. So the challenge I issued for this debate was in response to Dr. Koeman's assertion that the situation in Palestine is complicated. And that's a common ploy to discourage criticism of Israel. We had the same thing in South Africa. People would say, oh, the situation in South Africa is so complicated, you can't, you need to go there and see for yourself. Well, that was a ploy to stop criticism of apartheid South Africa. And Israel is using the same tactic. The situation in Palestine is very straightforward. In a word, it's colonisation. The movement of Jewish people from around the world to take over Palestine, to displace and subjugate the existing indigenous Palestinian population. And some of that existing indigenous Palestinian population were Jewish. Theodor Herzl, often referred to as the father of Zionism, and Zionism here I mean the belief in the need for a separate Jewish state, described it as a colonial idea. And he said it'll be easier to convince the English of this because the English have been setting up colonies all around the world, including this one here in this country, in New Zealand. They'll understand the idea of a state of Jews colonising Palestine. So he believed, Theodor Herzl believed that Jews will be safe and secure only if they had their own homeland. He considered Uganda and Africa. He considered South America, even Australia. But the movement eventually focused on Palestine, linking the ancient land of the Christian Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and the Quran with the Zionist project of a colonial state. It's important to emphasise that Zionism arose from, as David said, from persistent and widespread European anti-Semitism. Jewish communities in Europe were frequently targeted over many centuries across the whole continent, and Europe was where 90% of Jews lived at the time. In Russia, for example, whenever the Tsar and the ruling class came under pressure, they would redirect the anger and frustration of workers and peasants in pogroms against Jews, inciting mobs to burn homes, burn synagogues, and murder them. In this context of discrimination and oppression, it's easy to understand Zionist ideas gaining ground in Jewish communities in Europe. However, it was initially a minority fringe view. This is the Zionist idea among Jews, was initially a fringe idea compared to the majority of Jews in Europe who believed in socialist ideas of international solidarity of workers and which rejected anti-Semitism outright. But in the 1930s, immigration to Palestine quickened, although surprisingly in response to the Holocaust, most Jews fleeing Europe went to the US, Australia, Canada and New Zealand rather than go to or stay in Palestine. Even today, there are more Jews living in the US than are living in Israel itself. Zionism gained a greater following in the late 1940s for two reasons. The Holocaust, which was the Nazi attempt at the genocide of all Jews living in Europe, in which about 6 million Jews, along with communists, socialists, homosexuals and gypsies were murdered. And the second reason Zionism gained greater following in the late 1940s was the desire of the Western imperialist powers, the US and the UK, for a client state in the Middle East, one that could be relied on to support Western imperial interests in this oil-rich area. So when Britain gave up control of Palestine, the United Nations agreed to a Jewish homeland being established in Palestine, and a partition plan was signed in November 1947. 55% of Palestine was set aside for the Jewish homeland, despite Jews making up just 30% of the population. Almost 400,000 Palestinians were to live in the area assigned for the Jewish state, which would have had a small majority of Jewish citizens. Okay? 400,000 Palestinians and slightly more Jewish people would be in this Jewish state that was to be created. However, well before the formal declaration of the Israeli state, which happened in May 1948, Israeli militia groups, including the Irgun and the Stern Gang, began a program of ethnic cleansing, driving out the Palestinian population. The Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic, had begun. Palestinians were beginning to pay a horrendous price for European anti-Semitism. The most infamous incident was a massacre of between 200 and 300 Palestinian civilians, men, women and children, at the village of Deir Yassin in April 1948. In his book, The Revolt, the story of the Irgun, the leader of the Irgun and later Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin wrote, "The massacre was not only justified, but there would not have been a state of Israel without the victory at Deir Yassin." 2 weeks after Deir Yassin, Israeli militias hurled explosives into the crowded Arab quarter of Haifa. Barrel bombs filled with petrol and dynamite were rolled down the alleys and created a chaotic inferno, while loudspeakers of the Jewish militia broadcast recordings of screaming and shrieks of terror, and in Arabic, cries of "Run for your lives, the Jews are using poison gas." Less than a week later, the same tactics were used to empty Jaffa. About 250,000 Palestinians fled or were driven out at gunpoint before Israel declared independence in May 1948. After independence, 5 neighbouring Arab countries mounted a token military operation against the newly formed Israeli state, in part to try to protect the Palestinian population. Israeli propaganda portrays this often as 600,000 Jews surrounded by 70 million hostile Arabs, but the reality is absolutely different. What did these 5 Arab countries mount in terms of an army against Israel? 15,000 Arab soldiers with 22 light tanks and 10 Spitfire aircraft faced 30,000 highly trained Israeli soldiers, another 32,000 second-line troops, plus 50,000 police and Home Guard personnel. The leadership of the Arab countries was as useless and corrupt then as it is today across most of the Arab world. They gave lip service to supporting Palestinians, but that was all, lip service and a token military operation. And in Jordan, even began negotiating with Golda Meir as the conflict began. So it was a one-sided conflict, and by the time international pressure was brought to bear, Israel had taken over 80% of Palestine, including most of the productive land. Now, Israeli propaganda tries to argue that the reason Palestinians left their land and homes was because neighbouring Arab countries told them to leave in preparation for an Arab invasion of Palestine. This is untrue and was debunked by Israeli historian Benny Morris in the 1980s. Palestinians were driven out by Israeli terrorism in what the leading Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, described as a miraculous simplification of our tasks. In all, between 750,000 and 1 million Palestinians fled or were driven out of Palestine at gunpoint. Every day since 1948, Palestinians have had more land stolen, more houses bulldozed, more civilians harassed, attacked and killed, and more Palestinian children murdered with absolute impunity whenever Palestinians have resisted. Somehow Palestinians are not supposed to resist. This would be the same as if we said to France was occupied by Germany in the Second World War. Do we tell the French resistance, don't fight against German occupation of your country? Of course we don't. We applaud the resistance of the French against German occupation of their country. Some of us do. And I think we should absolutely respect the resistance of Palestinians to having their land taken from them. Every single day, today, yesterday, the day before, more Palestinian homes are being bulldozed, more Palestinian families driven off their land, more Palestinians made homeless, more Palestinians living in a Palestine where they have no rights at all. So while Israel was set up, under the United Nations Charter, every day since then, it has been in breach of the United Nations Charter, in violation of international law, in violation of United Nations Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. A deep-seated racism is always at the heart of colonialism, and Israel is no exception. Quote, "The way to deal with Palestinians is to beat them up, not once but repeatedly. Beat them up so it hurts so badly until it's unbearable." These were the words of Benjamin Netanyahu talking about Palestinians. Now imagine that we can go back to the Israeli leadership from 1948, starting with David Ben-Gurion, all the way through. You find the same attitudes towards Palestinians. So imagine if anybody said the same thing but changed the word Palestinians for the word Jews. Imagine if that happened. Everybody in this room would quite rightly condemn that as anti-Semitism. So why is the world silent? Why are our leaders in the Western world silent? Why are supporters of Israel silent when Israeli leaders spew hatred on the Palestinian population year after year, week after week? Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and I'm going back several decades because I'm talking about 70-year history here. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan said in 1967, after taking over the West Bank, that Palestinians should be made, quote, "to live like dogs, and whoever wants to can leave, and we shall see where this process ends." Palestinians are told repeatedly that they should accept defeat and go to Jordan or Egypt or any other Arabic-speaking country in the region. What Moshe Dayan and Netanyahu are saying to Palestinians would be the equivalent of New Zealand Europeans saying to Maori, "We've taken over your land now, so bugger off and go back to Polynesia. And if you want to stay here without citizenship and without rights, we will brutalise you whenever you resist." Meanwhile, on the positive side, let's have a talk. Let's get positive here. On the positive side, there is condemnation of the Israeli government from courageous Jewish groups and individuals outside Israel and around the world. They speak out again and again against the violent, vicious policies of the Israeli state, and they are an inspiration to all of us. Meanwhile, Palestinians who survived the Nakba and stayed in Israeli-controlled areas of Palestine have citizenship of the State of Israel today, and they have seats in the Israeli parliament. But they do not as David Kuman said before, have equal rights. They suffer under an apartheid system of laws which discriminate against them. As George Orwell might have said, all Israeli citizens are equal, but some are more equal than others. Or as Netanyahu puts it, Israel is not a state for all its citizens. If you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you are exempt from military service in the Israeli Defence Force. In fact, you are banned from military service in the Israeli Defence Force. And because you have not served, you are denied state assistance in a whole range of areas. If you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you are a second-class citizen. You are living in an apartheid state. So who's the international expert on apartheid? Well, I'm going to put forward one name, Bishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. He lived his life under the apartheid system. Kia ora. He lived his life under apartheid in South Africa, and he helped at the end to bring an end to apartheid through chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what does Bishop Tutu say? This Nobel Peace Prize winner says the situation is worse for Palestinians than it was for black South Africans under apartheid. Tutu says, I have witnessed the racially segregated roads and housing in the Holy Land that reminded me so much of the conditions we experienced in South Africa under apartheid. When he is asked what the world should do about Israelis' discriminatory policies, he says, name it apartheid and boycott. Most importantly for us in New Zealand, Tutu says, he's talking about black South Africans, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world who through non-violent means, such as boycotts and disinvestment, encouraged their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime. Kia ora. It's important to remember in this context that Israel, the UK and the US were the last three supporters of apartheid South Africa at the United Nations when the rest of the world was condemning the apartheid policies in place against black South Africans. The situation in Israel was such a close parallel to South Africa that Israel was a natural ally. Back in the 1960s, white South African President Hendrik Verwoerd used to say, why is everyone picking on South Africa? Israel has the same system we have. So why are we being singled out? Good question. So how do Israeli leaders get away with these racist policies? One important way is by the trick. So what is the trick? Speaking in 2002, former Israeli Education Minister Shalomit Aloni was interviewed in the US on the site Democracy Now!, and the interviewer asked this question. Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew? Ms. Aloni's response was this, quote, well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe someone is criticising Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticising Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And that is to justify everything we do to the Palestinians. End quote. We see this trick used in New Zealand and around the world frequently, and we've seen it used tonight. In fact, Israel has given up trying to win the argument for a Zionist state, for a colonial state. They know it is indefensible. So their focus has shifted to trying to shut down criticism of Israel. But throwing around claims of anti-Semitism like confetti against BDS supporters will not stop the struggle for Palestinian rights. What should New Zealand's response? I think it should be based on three things. Firstly, we must recognise that the so-called two-state solution is no longer possible. It has been buried under illegal Israeli settlements. The solution lies in a single secular state where all ethnic and religious rights are protected in a democratic constitution which gives everybody equal rights. Secondly, in this country, we have a developing understanding of colonisation and its devastating effects on Māori. We have begun to move forward on this as a country, but we have a long way to go. Thirdly, New Zealanders have a proud record of standing up against racism and injustice. We took action in support of black South Africans suffering under apartheid, and we can take action now to support Palestinians suffering under Israeli apartheid. New Zealanders must demand the end of Israeli military occupation of Palestinian land, the right of return for Palestinians expelled by Israel, and the end of apartheid laws discriminating against Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. And New Zealanders must support Palestinian calls for boycott, divestment and sanctions. This means, for example, ending New Zealand super fund investments in Israel, closing the Israeli embassy in Wellington and boycotting Israeli goods. The fevered attempts by Israel to close down the BDS movement shows just how crucial it is for bringing positive change in Palestine. And we can multiply our effectiveness in doing these things by working together. So join your local PSNA group. I want to finish with an appeal to the New Zealand Jewish community. I want you to consider the Star of David. For thousands of years, it has been a positive symbol of Jewish religious and cultural practices, a symbol of the deep, rich family and community values that are at the heart of Judaism and at the heart of Jewish communities. Now I want you to consider what the Israeli state has done with the Star of David on the Israeli flag. Successive Israeli governments have transformed it into a symbol of colonization, a symbol of subjugation, a symbol of military aggression and occupation, a symbol of apartheid, a symbol of brutal oppression. I appeal to Jewish communities across this country to reclaim the Star of David from Zionist ideology and rehabilitate it as a symbol of Jewish values, a symbol of religious and ethnic tolerance, a symbol of compassion and a symbol of pride, a symbol emphasizing the mystical Hebrew concept of Tikkun Olam, healing or restoring the world. Not sure about the pronunciation. I'm sure you can help me with that. This means insisting that the New Zealand Jewish Council rename itself the New Zealand Zionist Council. It also means helping create a new Jewish council to emerge with the values needed to support freedom and justice for all peoples, beginning with the freedom of Palestinians in the land they have lived in for thousands of years. We know this will be difficult, but you also need to know that across New Zealand, there are many allies in the fight for Palestinian freedom and in the fight against the rise of anti-Semitism. I personally have been privileged to work alongside many Jews who were key players in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and who have supported and applauded our efforts in the struggle for Palestinian human rights. Some of these courageous Jews have been Holocaust survivors themselves. They recognise racism, they recognise apartheid, and they utterly reject the Zionist ideology. Our group, the Palestine Solidarity Network Aotearoa, will be with you at the forefront in fighting anti-Semitism. We hope that more of you will be at the forefront in the struggle to liberate Palestine. Kia ora koutou, I look forward to your questions.
David's just reminded me that we were supposed to have 2 minutes to answer each other before the...
We could do, yeah.